friends and comrades. The partial setback for the MAGA Republicans follows a similar election result in Brazil. The Brazilian Trump-style president, Jair Bolsonaro, was also narrowly defeated. But just as in Brazil, this far-right tendency is nowhere near disappearing. These election results also have global implications, especially for Ukraine, since the MAGA Republicans support Putin. For example, we saw attendees at the fascist and Republican-linked America First conference last February who were chanting Putin, Putin, Putin. And these fascists have direct representatives in the US Congress, as shown by the fact that among the speakers at the America First conference was Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. The question is whether these election results in both the US and Brazil represent a reversal of the global trend towards bigotry and reaction, or whether it is merely a temporary setback for that. In order to answer that question, I think it's necessary to start with considering a little bit of the background. A consideration of that background can only be very general for time reasons. But I want to be clear, I'm not defending this turn to reaction. I'm just trying to explain it in the best way that I can. In the first place, we have the crisis of US and world capitalism. That crisis was part and parcel of the so-called globalization of the world economy. And that globalization, among other things, thrust the workers of the world into ever deeper and more direct competition for who could make the most profits for the capitalists. That's the so-called race to the bottom. It resulted in lower pay everywhere and the transfer of a lot of production to low-wage areas. At the same time, it meant the weakening of the ability of the government to regulate the economy in any way. Also, US society was changing. Whole new groups of people, mainly people of color, were entering the country, and also gender roles were being redefined. Another fundamental aspect of this process is the irreversible decline in US world domination. And this entire process took place under Democratic and Republican administrations alike. The Democrats could not try to capture the reactionary drive to return to the past, make America great again, because of their links to the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and so on. The Republicans, given the traditions that that started under Nixon of the Southern strategy, the Republicans could. And all of this in a world that was increasingly insecure due to job loss. In a different situation, these changes could have been seen as liberating, but for tens of millions of workers, it was the opposite. That was so also because of another factor, the determined campaign to drive out from historical memory all the traditions of the 1930s, the militant class struggle, as well as the radical anti-capitalist traditions. It is understandable and to be expected that the capitalist media, the education system, and the capitalist politicians, Republican and Democrat alike, would do this. But what was most devastating was and is the fact that the entire union bureaucracy, the so-called progressive as well as the conservative wings, participated in this effort. In other words, the general loss of a sense of working class solidarity. The result was that tens of millions of US workers were driven to try to recapture the so-called American dream. So that is what Make America Great Again, MAGA, that is the role that it plays. Return to the American dream at home and abroad. And of course, as the American comedian George Carlin put it, it's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. But the fact that it never really existed, especially not for Black people in the US, made MAGA all the more reactionary and all the more out of touch with reality. Now, some socialists claim that US workers don't support Republicans and MAGA. That is simply wishful thinking. The best single estimate of class, as done by the pollsters, is education level, not income level. And all the polls show absolutely decisively that Trump supporters are overwhelmingly non-college graduates. That's the reverse for Biden supporters. My own personal experience among construction workers tends to confirm this also. That doesn't, oh, by the way, when I said non-college graduates, what I'm talking about actually is white non-college graduates. That doesn't mean that white workers are hopelessly reactionary, not at all. But reality is reality, and we cannot engage in wishful thinking if we want to accomplish anything. Now, under more or less stable conditions, the capitalist class has a deep base of support in all sectors of society, including the working class. That was certainly true for the US capitalist class, and that's partly why capitalist democracy, or what they nowadays call the rule of law, is the best and safest means for the capitalist class to rule in the US. There are also some other reasons. In most cases, the capitalist class was able to sway huge sectors of society to back any policies they favored. But due to the developments I just mentioned, their influence among huge sectors of society declined enormously. A vacuum opened up. And because of the role of the union bureaucracy and also the NGOs in general, that vacuum was not filled by any sort of independent movement of any sector of the working class. That is what explains the rise of Trump. He was neither under control of any sector of the capitalist class, nor did they in general support him initially. For example, during the 2016 Republican primaries, the Wall Street Journal carried editorials and columns attacking Trump almost every single day after he won the nomination, and especially when he pushed through his so-called tax reform. They stopped attacking him, but he was never under their control. You can see it in the lack of control of Trump in his consistent attacks on NATO and his orientation towards Putin. You could also see it in his drive to take one-person control over the government. And that drive was largely blocked by, guess who? The tops of the US military. As Mike Mullen, former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, made clear, the military commanders would obey every, quote, legal order of the president. The underlying message was that they would disobey an order that they considered to be illegal. That was why Trump was unable to declare martial law and seize the ballot boxes in 2020, because the most clear representatives of the capitalist class, the military tops, would not allow it. And it's a sorry day when we have to depend on the US military to defend democracy. An example of why that was so was the fact that, according to the New York Times, in January of 2021, the leadership of the unions got together with the NGO leaders and decided that they were going to do everything within their power to prevent any sort of mass mobilization to drive Trump out of office at the end of his term. Trump and his supporters tried to overturn the elections through the courts, but in the end, even the Trump Supreme Court ruled against him. I believe that was due to several main factors. First was the fact that he would have needed to overturn the election in at least 3 states, which was a stretch too far for the Trump Supreme Court. Also, they were not well enough organized. And finally, they couldn't find a legal constitutional cover for it. In other words, the capitalist class had too many levers to pull still. But what they had done was take over the Republican Party lock, stock, and barrel. Trump, who one could say is the greatest snake oil salesman that ever lived, had built a base of fanatics, an actual personality cult that took over the Republican Party. The most clear indication of their threat to democratic small d norms is their denial of the reality of who won the 2020 elections. That denial is, in reality, a refusal to accept any outcome other than the one they desire, which is the complete and unchecked domination over US society by their cult. And their campaign against abortion rights is another example of this. It is the poster child for gaslighting. They still control the party is shown by the election deniers in these elections. According to the Washington Post, of the 569 Republican nominees for office, 291 were election deniers. The Post writes, Unofficial projections Tuesday show that the election deniers will amount to a sizable majority within the Republican caucus. I think you can see that that is a screenshot from CNN, and it shows some of the election deniers. These deniers are a minority in the US at the base level, at the rank and file level. But given the regional differences, plus gerrymandering, plus voter suppression, they play an outsized role. And don't forget that they do have a base, as their denialism is coupled with science denialism, plus bigotry and racism. An example is Doug Mastriano, the Republican nominee for Pennsylvania governor. Mastriano is close to being an outright fascist, if he is not actually one. Now, the media reports that he was overwhelmingly defeated, but the fact is that he got nearly 42% of the vote. Nearly 2.25 million Pennsylvanians voted for him. Not all of them supported Mastriano's fascism, but they were willing to accept it or overlook it. The drive among the Republicans is apparently getting the Democratic Party base more active. I got a report from somebody in rural Pennsylvania, the heart of Trump country. She reports that the activism among Democratic voters has increased a lot, both in terms of their meeting size, and they're putting out yard signs for Democrats and so on. An amusing report a guy I know from Philadelphia, PA, is that one friend of his decided to vote for the Democratic Party candidate, John Fetterman, because the Republican, Oz, is from New Jersey, and he hates New Jersey. My friend also told me that another person, a relative of his, had switched to voting for Fetterman because Oprah Winfrey endorsed him. Regarding the question of racism, back when Bush ran for president, he leaned heavily on the alleged threat of, quote, violent criminals, which was a dog whistle for racism. The same is true today, but there is more to the story than that. Here's a mailer sent around by a group that was backed by the coal train and corporate lobby here in Oakland. You see the ones that they recommend. De La Fuente is the foremost big business representative, but all three are in that group. I'm proud to say that, as you can see, I was the last one of the of the other photos. Along with many others, a major issue of their campaign was violent crime in Oakland. And this is not simply a dog whistle for racism. Oakland is 56% Black or Latino. And I could see in the forums that I spoke at that the issue of crime and violence hits very close to home for many people. People complain constantly about the catalytic converters, which are worth up to $2,500, being cut out from under their cars. And in a recent case, somebody who confronted a thief over this was shot dead in broad daylight. Of course, the issue is related, as I pointed out in my campaign, to the issues of poverty, for one thing. And I called for a $28 an hour minimum wage, and also to the breakdown of society in general. I called for a renewed working class grassroots movement for that increased minimum wage, as well as other demands, and for a working class party. Under such a movement, only under such a movement will that alienation fade as a sense of solidarity comes to the forefront. Now, you can, where is it? Oh yeah. I'm looking for the, okay, yeah. So now, if you look here, okay, so now you can see the election results here. Under the ranked choice voting, the tabulating of these results is very complicated. But so far, Taylor and De La Fuente, who were two of the right-wing law and order type candidates, got 47% of the vote, while the liberal union-backed candidate Sheng Tao got 29%, or together with the other main liberal, Villanueva, the result was 36%. So more recent tabulations indicate that Taylor will win. This is the candidate who said of the anti-Semitic fascist Peter Liu that he has some, quote, interesting ideas. Incidentally, I spoke with a Jewish group in the Bay Area that lobbies against, as I said, I spoke with a Jewish group in the Bay Area that lobbies against anti-Semitism, and they had no interest in picking a fight with the person who seems to be set to be the next mayor here. A related issue is that of homelessness. Those three right-wing candidates, De La Fuente most of all, basically called for kicking the homeless out of Oakland, and who cares where they go or what happens to them. It indicated the same heartless, cruel attitude that the Republican Party advocates. Then you see the results. My point is that this is not purely racism that is driving the law and order mood, although in many cases it is, but it's also the ongoing weakness, the crisis of US capitalism. Now, as far as the end results, it's of the general election, it seems the Republicans will probably, but not certainly, capture a slim majority in the lower house, the House of Representatives. The reason that they do better there is that it's easier to gerrymander and manipulate the voting districts. The Democrats retained their slim majority in the Senate. But again, the results in the Georgia Senate race were astounding. The Republican, Herschel Walker, campaigned in large part for prohibiting all abortions. But it was revealed that he'd pressured at least two former girlfriends whom he'd made pregnant to get an abortion, and he paid for those abortions. Yet he basically tied his opponent, Raphael Warnock. There will be a runoff for that post, and Warnock has already said he's going to campaign on the basis of character, that Walker lacks the character to be a senator. That is not exactly calculated to inspire people, especially given that Walker revealed that Warnock had used his position as a senator to enrich himself, which of course all the senators do. But overall, the Wall Street Journal, who expresses the views of the more militant sector of the capitalist class, summarized the situation when they wrote 2 days after the election, quote, "Republicans are dismayed, and they should be, at themselves. Some 70% of voters Tuesday said they're unhappy with the state of the nation. With an unpopular president, 8% inflation, falling real incomes, rising crime, and chaos at the border, the GOP should have coasted to at least a normal midterm victory. And the result, there will be bloodletting in the House Republicans as the hidden denialists who are grouped around DeSantis and the Republican House leader, Kevin McCarthy, will try to push the politics of the more crazed Republicans, such as Taylor Greene and the House Freedom Caucus, into the background. Given that their more blatantly crazed views have been proved to lose elections in many cases, I think the Freedom Caucus may tend to fragment, but others feel emboldened. Already, the open denialists are moving to remove Republican House Leader McCarthy and Republican Senate Leader McConnell. However, the predictions of a return to at least an appearance of sanity are overstated. That's because the Trump cultists at the bottom have largely taken over the party, and they won't allow any real change. As we all see, there's a bitter struggle between Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis developing, as DeSantis prepares to run for the 2024 Republican nomination. And let's be clear, the only difference between the two is that DeSantis is not so narcissistic and therefore a lot more competent. But there's no difference between their politics. Incidentally, every major newspaper in Florida backed DeSantis's opponent. But DeSantis has emerged as a winner anyway. And if you look you can see that is how the Trump supporting New York Post, how they are now picturing the result of the outcome of the election.
John, I just want to give you a 20-minute time check. So you've got about
Okay.
10 to 15 minutes left. Please make me co-chair, by the way. Please give me co-chair power.
The position of the Democrats, as exemplified by Biden, is that the problem with the Republicans can be defined in one word: Trump. But that's why all the pundits, by the way, are turning towards DeSantis. As the Wall Street Journal again pointed out, in what must have been a first on CNN, a panel of seven commentators had nothing but positive things to say about DeSantis. Now, regarding Ukraine, the Republicans will push for cutting off aid to Ukraine, and Biden has been hesitant enough already. And one wing of his administration, centered around the Chief of Staff, Mark Milley, is pushing for that, while another wing, centered around his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is opposing that. But if they are not already headed in that direction, I think a wing of the Trump base will increasingly move towards terrorist violence, especially if Trump loses in 2024 or whatever Republican. We tried elections and it didn't work, will be their thinking. The final question is, where do socialists and others who take the working class position go? What do we advocate? And I think the most pressing issue, the most important task before the working class, is to stop the drive to overturn our democratic rights, meaning capitalist democracy. US democracy, with all its historic and present day crimes, is a lot better than one-person dictatorship. How do we oppose the overturning of democratic rights while still fighting for working class independence? I will get into my view in a minute, but I want to comment on voting for the Democrats. There, in the past and at the present, there are two basic considerations. First is whether things would be better under one of the parties than the other. The second is the danger of getting sucked up into Democratic Party, which is to say capitalist politics. In the past, the differences were so minimal and the second danger was so great that I think it was right to oppose voting for any Democrat. Today, the second danger, getting sucked up into the Democratic Party politics, still exists. But anybody who says that the differences are minimal today really is not paying attention. So if we agree that it's crucial to stop the Republicans, then at the end of the day, we have to spend 1 or 2 minutes voting accordingly. And the only alternative to the Republicans right now is the Democrats. The Democrats have proven that over the longer term, they cannot stop the Republicans. So the only way to stop them is to build an independent working class movement, a movement from below that's headed towards building an independent working class party based on social principles. And ultimately, I think such a party, while it wouldn't even necessarily start out as an electoral party, that it will have to take a position on running for elections, and it will either support Democratic candidates, which will mean that it will no longer be an independent working class party, or it will run its own candidates. Ignoring the elections, I don't think is an option. Some argue that if we plan to vote for a Democrat, that we can't also argue for a working class party and for socialism. I believe that my campaign as the working class socialist candidate for Oakland mayor proved that that is not the case. So in conclusion, if you watch CNN or listen to the Democrats, you can see that they would like to return to the old collaboration between the Republicans and the Democrats. And they think that Donald Trump is the cause of the end of that collaboration. An article in Foreign Affairs, the foremost journal of the strategists for US capitalism, explains the reality in this comment on the 2020 election. Quote, the contentious election season should leave no one sanguine for the future. The autocratic populist turn of Trump presidency arose from deep fractures in the US politics and society. The roots of Trumpism don't begin or end with Trump, or even with American politics. They are closely connected to economic and political currents affecting much of the world. The exact same thing can be said now too, also 2 years later. The alternative is certainly not what they call, quote, bipartisan politics, which is to say Republican-Democratic collaboration, nor is it the Democrats in general. The alternative is the mobilization, the independent mobilization of the working class in the streets, in working class communities and schools, and equally important, in the unions themselves, headed towards building a working class party and also for socialism.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. John, will you make me co-chair, please?
I made you co-host.
Did you? Okay. All right.
I thought I did.
Well, yeah, just double check because I don't see that, but anyhow, you can check again. We have plenty of time for a really full discussion here, including time for differences of opinion, which are encouraged here because this is a very, I'd say one of the most challenging topics for socialists in the times that we're living in. And I see Linda's got her hand raised. So I'm going to be very generous with speaking time. And I see that Linda's got her hand raised and then Pete Glosser. So go ahead, Linda.
Oh, hi. Just listening to you talk about the working class and the crises that it faces and all the things that the MAGA worldview is, as this populist autocratic movement, it occurs to me that women are going to come in for a lot of the blame for the economic problems, of these MAGA people. And I can see worldwide. I mean, we already saw the, getting rid of abortion rights was a really important part of, of their agenda. But I could see, worldwide a push, to increase the power of religion now that people are becoming more secular, and as a political force to strip women of as many rights as possible in order to appease, this what they call the white working class. I mean, that's a really horrible description, I think. But the base of the MAGA movement, which is the same as the Putin's base, Bolsonaro's base, all these countries that have either fascist governments or are in danger of having fascist governments. The same people support them all over the place, and this is one unifying thing that all those people could find. Even more so than ethnocentrism or racism. Nativism is also another unifying thing that these people are really into. And one of the things that people like Putin and other leaders do is they create a lot of refugees, to flood the countries of that they don't like. But I mean, I'm getting off the topic. I mean, I think really we're going to see women become more and more of a target. And I mean, Iran really shows that too. And I'm all done.
Pete. Oh, Pete, you're muted. I guess I can't unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go
Okay.
ahead.
All right. I have one kind of wacky comment I want to throw out without expecting an immediate response. Before I say that, I'd like to give a thumbs up to the last comment because I think clearly, attacks on women and the role of women, and as Iran shows, a wide social response, even among men, to the most oppressive kind of attacks on women, is clearly a pillar of any resistance against the worldwide neo-fascist tendency. the connections between neo-fascism and real fascism are historically problematic, but I think at this point we're justified in calling the Republicans, for example, fascists and even Nazis. That said, I have something else I want to get onto. Clearly, collaboration of any form with the Democrats, as has been shown by the so-called DSL, well, not so-called, because the people here support them, and I can understand that, has been very difficult to control because you get absorbed. Partly because the political system in the United States was expressly designed to prevent the functioning of political parties in the way in which they should function, which is to say, at the so-called grassroots level as a nexus for organization and policy on from the local level on up. You can't do that in the United States. You say, I'm a Democrat, what does that mean? They send you emails, if you're ever dumb enough to send them money, which I've done. They send you emails saying, oh, your membership is canceled. What the hell does it mean to be a member of the Democratic Party? Nothing. So that's an issue. What I think that may lead to is this, that there should be at the local level influencers who are at least closet socialists who can counter the local Republican influencers who may not be as powerful as they are seen to be. An example of that is north central Ohio, where I'm from, a little town called Bucyrus, where I think a year or two ago there was a big, that is to say about 110 people, but for Bucyrus, huge, it's only a town of 10,000 people, a big march for the BLM cause. And lots of people joined it, got a favorable write-up in the local paper. And it was organized by somebody whose name I don't know and whom I don't know. I haven't lived there for, I don't know what, 60 years. So, that showed me that not every part of Ohio is necessarily advanced. I mean, even in advanced country, there are places like Bucyrus, which is an industrial town, formerly. It still has a lot of industrial activity, Timken roller bearing, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to go on about this at great length. What I derive from that single incident is the idea that it isn't necessarily sewn up on that level, that there's a lot of potential support there, as perhaps there isn't in the more Appalachian regions of Ohio, for something progressive, if it can be clear-sighted and for workers. I don't know how that's going to work. I think a possible way to approach that, if you were going to collaborate with Democrats, which God forbid, but it might be to meet with AOC and Rashida Tlaib and Bernie Sanders and or equivalent. Of course, they wouldn't, but still, and talk to them, say on behalf of the Ukrainian Socialist Solidarity Committee, that we're in favor of solidarity with Ukraine, we're in favor of socialism, and we want in favor of local organizations that can do things for people that the Democratic Party can't or won't do, such as mutual aid, education, perhaps other functions that are going to be immediately helpful to people, and a cadre of local organizers who will be known and understood. Now, I can talk about this, but I have zero leadership ability and my wits are deserting me minute by minute, but it's still an idea that I'd like to throw out. Enough said.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Mudassar.
Good night all, and good morning to everyone, whoever is in the USA. So basically my question to you is like to John sir is basically, now we saw that Democrats almost flipped the house and things like that, but can we also but when Trump is going to contest elections in 2024, God forbid, that if he may come to office, whether there is going to be a Russia or a Saudi Arabian collusion to bring him back to the house, because one video from Abdullah Auda, that is the son of imprisoned father Salman al Auda, he had published a video where Salman bin Bandar, the crown prince that time, had said that we influence USA's elections. So isn't that going to be the underlying factor in American politics? That is firstly my first point. And regarding the Democrats also, it was a very good perspective what John Sir laid, that because if you look at the Democrats, they are not very vocal on Iran. They are wanting to revive the deal and wanting to help the Iranian regime somehow to increase the hegemony in the Middle East. So, what is the next alternative to that? Because you see, many Democratic senators are also linked with these far-right Hindu nationalist groups back in our country. So, what is the alternative of like the real socialists? I mean, not the campist ones. So that's my second question. And the last and the final question is, how can we build solidarity, that is start a grassroots movement in order to defeat both the Republicans and the Democrats and that is the campus left, in order to make our voices heard without any influences, of course. That's what I want to say, and thank you very much.
John, did you capture his questions?
I got two of them. One was the alternative to the Democrats and Trump, and the other, Mudassir's last point about how to build solidarity at the base, and while at the same time keeping out the Republicans, the Democrats, and the campus left. I think that's.
Mudassir, maybe you can clarify your third question. You can send it.
It was his first question that I didn't.
The first question.
I have to apologize. My hearing isn't that great.
No problem, sir. I'll repeat my question again. So basically, the fact was that the Saudi royal family, the crown prince that time, that was Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia, had claimed that he influences elections in the USA. You're hearing me? You're able to get my question, sir?
Cheryl, did you get?
He's talking about the influence of the Saudis on the U.S. elections.
Yes, Saudis. Yes.
Yes.
So
okay.
So Saudi. So now recently I heard that I also got news that the crown prince's main businessman was hanging out with Trump. So is that going to have an impact on the 2024 presidential elections? Maybe the Saudis want to fit in the most favorite candidate, Trump, because they are not able to get things from the Democrats. And what I inferred from the fact is also, when they killed Khashoggi brutally in the embassy in Istanbul, consulate, it is because of his condemning Trump's policies in the Middle East. Is that what I am correct about? That's my last question. What the first question, basically, the influence of the Saudis after the Russians.
Okay.
I'm talking about the lobbying aspect of it.
Got it.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, sir.
We might have John come back and answer the questions before he finishes up at the end. But meanwhile, we're going to go on to Luke. Luke, go ahead, and you are muted.
Thanks. Yeah. I think one thing I'll do, maybe just kind of talk about what I've been involved in here in Chicago, because then I think it connects with a lot of these questions. So, in the U.S., there's a group called the Democratic Socialists of America. And they are, I don't know, 70,000 members on paper, might be kind of generous. Active membership, 10,000 members, might be generous. 15,000 members. So they are, at least where my thinking is now, they are the best thing that the left in the U.S. has going for it, in the sense that they are a large group of people as opposed to small, mostly isolated groups. So in terms of having a large group of people in which you can basically say anything you'd like to a certain extent and not risk getting immediately kicked out. They represent something in that area. So the DSA endorses candidates here in the United States. They endorse candidates, as far as I know, they have never endorsed someone they endorse people who run on the Democratic Party line. The DSA does not act, nor I think do most folks in it, certainly not the leadership, think of it as any kind of independent organization. So the attempt that the caucus that I'm in within the DSA is trying to make is essentially to strengthen the platform that the DSA has. It has a platform as of about 2 years ago. And then to emphasize holding the candidates that the DSA endorses to that platform, because I've heard a few folks make this point, which is that the problem is essentially controlling the candidates. For what it's worth, in my sense, I don't actually really care if someone is a Democrat or Republican or an independent, so long as they're actually controllable and accountable to the base of the people who elects them. So in my mind, if the DSA were to run someone on the Republican candidate line, the fact that they're on that line doesn't immediately disperse them. The problem is that these people aren't mandated, nor does the DSA have the power to make them accountable to the DSA's position. So, when folks mention meeting with AOC, other progressives, the DSA does do that to some extent. The problem is that AOC tells the DSA how to act. The DSA does not tell AOC how to act. And that's a main issue, because AOC, for example, says to them, if you think about doing something with Jamal Bowman, the DSA candidate who supports funding the Iron Dome, dare you not do anything to Jamal Bowman, for example. The DSA also does not, for example, discipline Jamal Bowman for going against the DSA's resolution that supports the BDS movement in Palestine. So there is this force in the U.S. that is actively engaged, very problematically in a lot of ways. It's very slow. Is my heart and soul in it? No, but it is very much engaged in this issue of candidates, and then crucially holding the candidate in to certain positions. Just very quickly, this question about the DSA being in the campus left. The DSA is far too big and amorphous to be considered specifically in any position. I also don't particularly like the term campus left, but I'll leave it there that the DSA, in my mind, is not yet a definite, determined entity. There are still struggles going on within it. And so the fact that it can't necessarily define in a hard way gives it strength and makes it very problematic. And I think it does need to be given definite direction in certain ways. So thanks.
Howie, and then myself, and then Simon.
Well, I'd like to give a Green Party perspective. I was the Green Party presidential candidate in 2020, but we have a saying in the Greens, 2 Greens, 3 opinions. So I'm not claiming to speak for the whole Green Party. In terms of, how big the Green Party is, in the states where they allow registration, there are about 250,000 people in the country who have registered into the Green Party, which only means you can vote in the Green Party primary. It's not like being a member in a membership party, but we don't really have membership parties, Democrats, Republicans, Greens, and I think that's a problem. I got about a little over 400,000 votes in 2020, which I think is the hardcore independent left vote, because that year, of course, Trump was on the ballot, and the general perspective is he's got to go. But I think in the current situation, independent political action by socialists is quite possible. And there are 2 ways forward. One is local elections. Some of them are nonpartisan, like in California. They're partisan in New York. But the Greens have currently, at the last count, 137 people elected to local office across 20 states. And because there's so many offices, if the left would get out of the Democratic Party and focus on that, we could be electing thousands. And that would create a platform, a political base for going to state legislatures and the House of Representatives. So that's one path forward. That's the old Republican path out of the Free Soil Party. You know, by the time Lincoln ran, the Republicans were the biggest caucus in Congress, and they built that from the bottom up over a decade. And the other path forward, I think, is electoral reform. I think one of the significant things of Tuesday was 10 more jurisdictions had ranked choice voting, and in 3 cases, proportional ranked choice voting, which yields proportional representation on legislative bodies. And in 6 of the 10 cases that passed, the 2 other cases are still out, Seattle and Nevada, which is for the whole state. And they're only lost in 2 rural counties in Washington. We went into 2020 with just over 20 jurisdictions that had ranked choice voting. We went into this election with 55 local jurisdictions in 2 states. And now it's going to be something like 63, 64, 65 jurisdictions. So this is something that is something we can push and win. And what it does is eliminates the spoiler problem. So, you know, people are saying, John said, we got to vote Democratic to defend democratic rights. But with ranked choice voting, you can vote for a Green or a Socialist and rank your Democrats second and still oppose the Republicans. The other thing it does, when it's proportional ranked choice voting, which passed in Portland, Maine, Portland, Oregon, and Ojai, I guess it's Ojai, California, it gets rid of gerrymandering. Because if you're ranking your candidates from multi-member districts, the district lines don't matter that much because it's proportional representation. Every party gets their proportional share of representation. And gerrymandering is one of the ways the Republicans in particular, in about 20 states they totally control, have magnified their pluralities into overwhelming majorities. For example, in Wisconsin on Tuesday, the election day, the Democrats got 51% of the statewide vote for their state house. But the Republicans, they only got 30% of the seats. The Republicans got 70% because of gerrymandering. And this is reflected in the House. And then we have anti-majoritarian institutions like the US Senate and the Electoral College, which magnify the right-wing vote, conservative rural states. So what I'm saying is pushing for these electoral reforms, I think opens the door for independent political action by socialists. Now in the presidential race, you know, I ran in 2020. A lot of people didn't like that because Trump was on the ballot. We're gonna have the same problem in 2024. And people are urging me to run again. And I'll tell you, there are 2 issues at stake. One is ballot lines. You get a certain vote in a lot of states, you get a ballot line, which makes it easier for down ballot Greens to run. That's important, you know, to the party. But the other question within the Greens, and this is going to be, I think, the top issue in our presidential, you know, primary and convention process, is we're split right down the middle between, on the question of Ukraine, between the campus and the consistent anti-imperialists. And that's going to be a big debate. Of course, it'll be reflected across the whole left because that's a problem, a debate on the whole left. So I think there will be a Green presidential campaign, and that's going to be the hot issue. And then just getting the democratic rights. One of the things I think people need to realize is the Democratic Party is not a friend of democratic rights. The Republicans have a frontal assault on voting rights, but the Democrats suppress voting rights by suppressing the Green Party. Or in the case of South Carolina, they just suppressed the Labor Party, the small remnant from the old Labor Party. And the leader, the lawyer who has been doing that since Nader ran in 2004 is Mark Elias, who everybody or most people probably know is the lawyer who put all these teams that beat Trump in all his fraudulent election fraud lawsuits. But he's really not for democracy, he's just for the Democrats, because he's been going after us. And, you know, I can tell you about our 2020 presidential campaign. He was all over the place, knocking us off the ballot. So we can't count on the Democrats for democratic rights. And I know I'm going on, but I just want to describe a little bit of what happened in New York. You know, it's basically, the House will be in Republican hands if it is, and it probably will be, because in New York, 5 seats were flipped, including my own district, where the Democrats and the new lines have a majority. But the Democrats ran a terrible candidate. His whole thing was, I fought in Iraq, I'm a Navy commander in the reserve, and I'm pro-police. And the Republican was a Trumpy, and the Republicans still beat him because they had tied this guy to the governor, Hochul, and the inflation issue. And the Democrats didn't have a message. Same thing with Hochul, the governor running against Zeldin, a election-denying Republican who ended up coming within 6 points, really a 3-point flip to beat the Democrat in a state where the Democrats' enrollment is 2-1 over the Republicans. And there are two things going on. One is the Democrats had no ground game, and that's because of gerrymandering. You know, once you get the nomination, you don't have to have a campaign. I mean, we've had Greens come to our local Green who in this city, which is all Democrats, and they got pushed out for pushing some issues, came to us. We ran them, but they came to us and they said, I don't know how to run a campaign because I never had to. You know, they got the nomination by, you know, inside the Democratic committee kind of politics, not going out to the voters. And the other thing that happened, you can see the banner, I ran for governor this time, had to be a write-in campaign because Cuomo and the whole Democrats passed a law that basically tripled the ballot access, and we lost our ballot line. So we had to get 45,000 signatures in 42 days. And that is the hardest petition in the country. Some have more signatures, but they have a year or two to get them. And we looked around the world, the only comparable petition we could find was in Putin's Russia. If you want to run as an independent for the state Duma from a oblast or one of their regions, it's 15,000 signatures in 45 days, which is the old New York standard, 15,000 in 42 days. And we actually shopped around a bill to Democrats leading up to this election. And I would tell them, let's just get back to the Putin standard. And they'd kind of chuckle nervously and admit we were right, but they didn't want to put it on into the legislature before the election because they were running for re-election. So that's all to say that the Democrats really don't believe in democracy. They just believe in Democrats. And so while I think voting defensively for Democrats, where that's the only option, you know, is justifiable, we need an alternative to that.
Okay. Really interesting on the ground information, Howie, and an excellent point about the Democrats are not for democracy. And you know, the average age of the people that are on this meeting today is, well, around my age, I'd say over 50. We have a few young people here, and I want to encourage them to speak up. Luke has already spoken, but I'm especially interested in hearing from the other young people here about their experiences and what they think about the future, because, well, we've been fighting for decades to try to overthrow capitalism, or at least change the world or build a movement that could do that. We haven't succeeded, so we're still trying. But in any case, so I wanted to read a quote, which I think is really appropriate for this moment. And what is, you know, in my decades of activism, especially I became a socialist, believed in revolution when I was a teenager. And I never thought, hold on just a second. I never thought I would see the day where defending bourgeois democratic rights would be, well, I won't call it a revolutionary act, but absolutely necessary. So, but it has in the age of Trump and authoritarian right-wing movements around the world. So this is a quote from Rosa Luxemburg that I came across. And I'm assuming everybody here knows who she was, but maybe not. Rosa Luxemburg was a famous anarchist revolutionary in Germany who fought to overthrow the German social democracy, the German republic, whatever. Anyhow, okay, so this is the quote. It's from a book that she wrote called Reform or Revolution, and it's from the chapter on conquest of power. If democracy has become superfluous or annoying to the bourgeoisie, it is on the contrary necessary and indispensable to the working class. It is necessary to the working class because it creates the political forms, autonomous administration, electoral rights, etc., which will serve the proletariat as fulcrums in its task of transforming bourgeois society. Democracy is indispensable to the working class because only through the exercise of its democratic rights in the struggle for democracy can the proletariat become aware of its class interests and its historic task. In a word, democracy is indispensable not because it renders superfluous the conquest of political power by the proletariat, but because it renders this conquest of power both necessary and possible. When Engels, in his preface to the class struggles in France, revised the tactics of the modern labor movement and urged the legal struggle as opposed to the barricades, he did not have in mind, this comes out of every line of the preface, the question of a conquest of political power, but the contemporary daily struggle. I'll leave it at that. I can put the link to that in the chat. But so we find ourselves in this. I don't think that anybody here disagrees with the fact that we have to defend bourgeois democracy. And even though for my entire lifetime, until the last few years, the idea of voting for a Democrat such as Biden would have been considered blasphemy and would have been cause for having you thrown out of the socialist movement. But that is where things are. And a few other things I want to talk about, just my own experiences in the atmosphere that we're in now. I mean, I know a lot of people, including people in my neighborhood, who know about my politics and who listen to me, and they don't think that I'm crazy to talk about how we need to, build a socialist working class movement, but they don't see it. It just lives as an abstraction to them. And this is part of the challenge. And it's also related to the fact that voting in and of itself, without in the context of building a movement in the streets, is the ultimate passive, it's just a passive act. And John forgot to mention in his presentation, well, because he wasn't really focused on his own campaign, but his primary slogan that he would use in the very short amount of time that he was allowed in these forums, which is about 2 minutes, was, "I'm not the vote for me, and I'll set you free candidate. I am the independent working class socialist candidate that is telling you the truth, which is we can't get any of the things that all the other candidates who are saying, oh, I'm going to solve homelessness, we're going to end crime, everybody's going to have a job, etc., without building this independent movement based in the working class, independent of the Democrats, that has a fighting program based on our interests as a class." So, I mean, that's the alternative, is I'm not the vote for me, set you free candidate. But of course, that idea is still very, very dominant. And of course is encouraged, as Howie pointed out, by the Democratic Party. That's exactly what they want. And thank you, Howie, for making that comment about Mark Elias, because he is one of the favorite talking heads on MSNBC and CNN as this great promoter of democracy, but in fact, he's not. Yeah, the other thing that for me is just, again, about the opportunity, the possibility of running socialist candidates. I mean, the Bernie Sanders, the influx of young people into DSA. I mean, the Bernie Sanders campaign and the massive amount of interest and support that he had because of the ideas that he was forced to raise. And in the last 10 years in this country alone and around the world, we have seen uprising after uprising. We've seen Black Lives Matters, the response to the murder of George Floyd. We've seen the Me Too movement. We've seen massive protests against for immigration reform. And I'm sure I've missed a few. And yet none of those have resulted in the building of movement that could run independent candidates. And just the last thing I want to talk about that is like my, the thing that is the most distressing to me is the lack of debate, of an honest debate around these ideas. I mean, we're having this here today, and I hope that there will be some different opinions expressed, but the average person, again, in terms of voting is passive, and people are not accustomed to what is actually democratic debate of the type that maybe, you know, existed when there was a larger socialist movement. People are not accustomed to that, so they're not accustomed to learning how to think. What I say to people is, don't leave your brain at the door. You know, we have the right to challenge things and ideas and come up with our own ideas. So I'm going to end it there. Okay, I've got Simon and then Brian.
Yeah, a very quick question actually, because we are on the meeting. I can say.
Your sound is really breaking up, Simon. Try it again.
And now?
That's good.
Okay.
Yeah, start over again. Please start over again.
Okay, over again. We are on the forum meeting organized by the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign. So the simplest questions that comes to my mind is, what do you think? Has the election results, or will the election results have any impact on the situation around Ukraine? And that's all I want to ask. What do you think about this?
Brian.
Okay, yeah, just a couple of quick notes and that sort of thing. I think one of the things that Cheryl mentioned about, well, two things. One about the neighbors and people, you talk to them and they kind of understand what you're talking about, but figure, you know, it's remote and that sort of thing. I think it's real important to keep that conversation going and that sort of thing. I've mentioned this once before, but I was in a situation where it came down to physical confrontations within the workplace. And people said, Brian's not a commie, Brian's for the people. You know? And I was like, okay, if that works, great, we're moving forward. And the thing is that I think that the left has to be able to show that it can deliver. And it can deliver particularly, I think, on local level and stuff like that, that local level politics are really important. And a lot of stuff is thrown, you know, into national politics and stuff. And I understand it's to start a conversation and stuff. But I think having candidates on a local level where you can, where it makes sense. And I think organizations like DSA, I have real questions about them, but I think they have the clout to be able to put up local candidates, their own candidates, who could conceivably win, particularly in cities. You know, so I think that that's important. And I think on the question of civil rights and, you know, voting rights and whatever, is that's something that's been a struggle since the nation was founded, when voting rights were limited to, you know, property owning white males and stuff. And so the struggle moving forward on that, and the civil rights struggle was based on that, was based on expanding voting rights. It's really important, I think, because it's a step to getting people the opportunity to be engaged, and then socialists have to leverage that power that people have to try to make a difference, you know, in their lives and that sort of thing. I find it a little discouraging when people have a tendency, some on the left, to say, well, I don't engage in the politics and that sort of thing, but that's the arena and that's where it's at. And if you want to work with people, you know, if that's where their heads are at, then that's where you go. You don't have them come to you and say, oh yeah, I recognize finally that you know all about surplus value, so I'm coming your way. You know, it's like people generally don't think that way. And so I think it's really important to be engaged where people are, and then it helps, you know, and have them show that not only do you support their efforts, you know, for a better life, but you also have a way to, you have a mechanism, you have a politic that can support that and that can move that forward. If it's, you know, kind of a disembodied sort of socialist presentation, I just don't think it goes anywhere in the end, other than making people satisfied that they don't care for something. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, Avram, go ahead.
Yes, there's a perception going on, like the Democratic Party, like we did a great thing. 'Cause normally there would be a total wipeout, like 60 or 70 Congress people would lose. But isn't it like that the candidates were so incredibly horrible that if they were actually talking about, which Biden timidly talked about, possibly taxing oil companies, or if they had that kind of appeal, would it be like, oh, well, they actually won the Congress in both houses? And the second question is, they're also saying gerrymandering, and of course that affected everything, but you had state elections, you had, excuse me, the Senate with Warnock, which John talked about, which I can't really figure that out. I'm getting like 5,000 emails for Warnock every minute, but nobody seems to deconstruct that, like what did they do wrong, and what he's saying is that he's going to talk about character. It sounds like he's going to like kind of lose if you're going to do that, but that's just some of my perception.
Okay. John, so I definitely, once again, so John, once you, I hope you're going to answer some of the questions that were asked, and then I hope we'll have another round. And again, I want to put a little encouragement under for the younger people and especially the women amongst us to speak.
Okay, so I am going to answer some of the questions asked, but I would like to start, and I hope this works. I'd like to start with this video, which is, this is a video of my election, part of my presentations at one of the forums, and I've added some visual to it also. I hope this works. Let's see. So you want to talk about the youth, and the youth are our future and all of that? Well, their future is being destroyed, let's be blunt about it, by capitalism. And we know, if you study history, that the only way that we're going to get any changes in this country, or any place in the world for that matter, is when working class and poor people organize and fight and demand those changes and make sure that the country, that the system does not run until we get the changes we want. I just want to explain, these are extracts from parts of, different extracts from my presentations at this forum. So they talk about the golden rule. That is, he who has the gold makes the rules. And we have to answer with something else. Might makes right. And so the only rights that we have are the ones that we are well enough organized to fight for and to demand and to bring into existence. We've got a double freight train roaring down the track towards us. The first is the racist, fascist, connected Republican Party, which has already taken over the Supreme Court, which very likely will take over Congress, and in 2 years from now, by hook or by crook, may take over the presidency. And every reform that we want to talk about and think about here in Oakland will be washed away like a sandcastle in front of the incoming tide if we don't have a movement to stop that. That's number one. The other is the whole question of global warming. This is an example of why we need a working class party, to oppose these two parties of big business. And we need a working class movement to reverse the direction of this whole country. And why not? And why shouldn't it start here in Oakland? Oakland was, incidentally, was the last general strike was here in Oakland, 1946. Oakland led the way with the Black Panther Party. Oakland led the way with Occupy Oakland. And we have to start again for Oakland to lead the way to reverse the whole direction of politics in this country and in the world. I'm not, vote for me and I'll set you 3 candidates. I'm the working class socialist candidate for the mayor of Oakland. And if my campaign does nothing but to get a few people resolved to organize and fight for the changes we need, then that's enough. So I wanted to post that.
We are being deceived. The border
Just a second.
crisis
Hold
is
on.
not
Sorry
like
about
what we've been told. Behind the 5 million illegal.
Sorry about that. So I wanted to post that as an example of how I think that we can relate to people who are not politically active or who are just thinking about getting politically active, but working class people and young people. And I have to say that people are not going to get active just around the issues that we think are important. And they're not going to do it in an organized, clear way. For those who aren't familiar with it, you know, like I always think about like the Occupy movement or the Yellow Vest movement in France, where millions of people just poured out into the streets, blocked and shut down cities all across the country in opposition to a new tax on working class people. And they had no clear program, they had no clear strategy. They just knew that they were pissed off and they wanted to do something about it. And it was enormously confusing movement. But I think that if there is a movement that's going to develop here in this country, it's going to be along similar lines. And the thing for us is to speak to that new movement, or the new movement that isn't even here yet, and to try to think about how young people and workers, what they're thinking now and how we can relate to that. So, and also we have to understand that, you know, we have to work out a lot of issues amongst ourselves. I'm talking about the old time socialists, myself included, but also not all those issues are going to relate to young people who are going to be the central element in the movement. So with that in mind, I want to make one comment about collaborating with the Democrats. And in my mind, there's a fundamental difference between taking 2 or 3 minutes at voting time and coloring some spaces on a sheet of paper and putting it in the mail, or putting a scrap of paper in a ballot box. There's a fundamental difference between that and running on the Democratic Party line, and which inevitably has to mean getting involved in trying to change the Democrats, trying to make the Democratic Party, trying to move it to the left and so on. And it's been proven just by what we've seen over the last 10 years, if not before, that the minute that you get involved in that, you look at, for instance, compare DSA to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is literally millions of times more powerful. And so it's like an object in space that's in between the sun and the earth. Which gravitational force is going to be more powerful? It's going to be the sun, whether you like it or not. And we've just seen it time and time and time again, that in every single case, they get sucked into the Democratic Party. And that has a practical consequence. And the practical consequence is that they cannot, and they do not, and they never have actually tried to build an independent movement of working class people, such as what I was describing, like could have been with the Yellow Vest movement and so on. Why? Because that's not the entire history of the Democratic Party is opposed to that. So I do think that any new movement that develops, if there's millions of young people and workers that pour out into the streets at some time, at some point, that we do have to do everything in our power to make sure that it doesn't get drawn into the arena of the Democratic Party through this or that or the other, quote, progressive Democrat. On the Green Party, I mean, I had thought after the 2020 election I'm sorry, 2016 election, when Trump came in, that there would be a whole layer of young people that moved to the Green Party. That didn't happen. And in my experience, number one, the Green Party has, I mean, I welcome Howie Hawkins here and other comrades from the Green Party, but I have not seen any history of the Green Party actually trying to build a movement in the streets. And that is going to be the starting point. We saw that with the Black Lives Matter movement. So, you know, that's kind of the main point to me. Now I'm just looking for, so Mudassir asked about the influence of Saudi Arabia in US elections. And I don't think it's that great, really. For one thing, you can see that both the two parties are, because Saudi Arabia is basically tied in with Israel, as far as I can see, with the only real difference being that Saudi Arabia has a lot of oil. And also has a base, you know, amongst like Islamic fundamentalists and so on. But I don't see them having that great of an influence. And as far as if Donald Trump runs again in 2024, I mean, if he runs or DeSantis runs, doesn't matter. They're both the same. I mean, there is, and when you come to the ballot, when it comes time to actually voting, there is no alternative to voting for the Democrats if you want to keep these fascist connected, and I don't call them fascists, but fascist connected Republicans out of office. So I think those are the main points. But again, I think that we should start, that our starting point has to be, how will this new movement develop? And how do we relate to it, even when it hasn't started yet?
John, do you want to answer Simon's question about Ukraine?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Sorry. So, I mean, I mentioned how the Republicans, Trump first and foremost, are connected with Putin. And given the Republicans, you know, their link to fascists like America First, who openly support Putin, you know, I think there's no doubt that, I mean, the Republicans, the far right Republicans are already now pushing for cutting off aid to Ukraine. And it's interesting, it's a bit of a role reversal, because the Republicans were always the ones who were really pushing US military intervention. But now, since they have political links with Putin, and I think since they realize that if Putin gains an advantage and wins something in this war, that it's going to strengthen the far right all around the world. So now they're pushing to cut off aid, in essence, to Ukraine. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. Before I call on Linda, Tandiwe, don't go. I see. Thank you. Would you like to say anything before you leave? Tandiwe?
I don't want to say too much, but thank you so much for having me. I just really enjoyed listening to you guys. And it's actually one of my first elections that I was able to vote in. And I noticed like a lot of barriers, especially as a college student. I know our age group and young people, you were talking about young people. People always say that like we don't show up with voting, and I never really understood why until I was like able to vote and see how hard it is to get those absentee ballots, and to really stay connected into like the grassroots movements that are going on in your hometown. But yeah, I enjoyed listening to you all, and I did invite a friend. Grandpa, really proud of you and your campaign. My friend voted for you, but I do have to go. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you so much for coming, and I hope that you'll join us again. We look forward to seeing you in California after you graduate.
Yes, me too.
Okay, I see Asania. Asania, would you like to say anything before you go? We really want to hear from young people, especially young women. Oh, I guess she's gone. Okay. All right.
Actually, sorry, I'll speak really fast.
Okay.
Again, thank you for having me. This was also my first year voting in this election that just happened. And like Tondiwe, I felt similarly, but also this discussion was really interesting as a sociologist major, like that's my major. So hearing this discussion helped expand on my perspective on a few of these topics. And also I learned something new. So thank you.
So you're welcome to attend our future meetings, and we'll probably send you email notices about them so you can ignore them or respond. So thank you. Okay. Linda, are you going to talk about November 19th? Because I want to make sure we talk about that before we end this meeting.
No, I was just going to say something in defense of DSA.
Oh.
I mean,
all right. Well, all right. Yeah, I want to make sure that we talk about November 19th before people start signing off. So, but go ahead.
Well, I was a member of the Green Party, and I'm also a member of DSA. And I have to say that what DSA has done is really way in excess of what the Green Party was able to do. And I think they both started out with kind of the same, assets, so to speak, among the electorate. The Democratic Party would never tolerate a caucus of DSA in the Congress. I mean, they would never even recognize that a group like DSA or the Green Party or anything like that even exists. I mean, they've been, their main function in life has been to snuff out the left or use it to as an excuse for why they won't fight the right. They have this whole elaborate cosmology about spoilers and how we're to blame for everything, and all those hundreds of millions of people that don't vote because they don't have anything to vote for. Well, those people don't count, so they're not the reason why the Democrats always lose. So I mean, the essay is, it's got problems, but we had people on, and most of its national leadership is campused. But we had people on this meeting on the 10th from various dissident DSA chapters or individuals. There's a debate going on there, and it's a very important debate. And I don't know, I mean, in Minneapolis, we endorsed 6 local candidates for local office, including the state senate and state representatives, and they all won. In fact, a couple of them were incumbents, and one of them just became the leader of the House Democratic Caucus, or whatever it was. I mean, it doesn't sound wonderful when I put it that way, but it does represent a fissure that didn't exist, like 10 years ago. So anyway, that's my defense of the DSA. I'll shut up now before everybody gets mad at me.
I'm going to call on Brad before I call on Luke, because Brad just joined us, and yeah. So Brad, you missed the presentation as well as most of the discussion, but yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thanks. I'll be brief. Apologies for thinking this was going to be at 9 a.m. my time. And I can watch if you're recording this, I'll just watch the recording if I need to know what happened. So I'm going to be brief here. It's simply explain that much of the, I've been involved for years now with working together, collaborating with Ted Zor, who's not at this meeting, and a really deep dive into the historical and social nature of this thing we call the United States of America, and by extension, English-speaking North America, including Canada. And so I approach this whole thing from quite a different perspective and framework than is generally done by people on the left, basically. So I'm not gonna, it would require a certain amount of time for me to explain to people what that perspective is. But basically, the basic mistake that I think a lot of people make is that we have a party system in the United States made up of independently organized political parties, like Europe, for example, which has parliamentary systems generally. But we don't have a parliamentary system here. We have basically a state-sponsored, we have two state-sponsored parties. They have a monopoly of political power by monopolizing the state office. This was by design of the framers of the 1787 Constitution, who were hostile to what they called faction, which they equated with political party. And this is a radically different state-sponsored political system from just about every other state in the world, whether inside or outside of Europe. And that's basically where I take off in presenting a perspective of the present day political situation in the United States. So the last thing I'll say here is that I've come to the conclusion that the only way forward for any kind of left-wing politics, especially socialist and working class oriented politics in the United States, is to advocate for what I call a democratic revolution as a minimum demand, to displace and replace the entire political regime. There's no way, channel through the political regime, through any of its two parties, for a socialist and working class politics to advance. And I think the history of the last 100 years demonstrates that, which would require a whole presentation to prove it. But that's my conclusion. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Brett. So people are starting to sign off. So I just want to point out in the chat, Brian posted the link to register to participate online to this event that is being sponsored by Code Pink and the Answer Coalition. It is, well, I'm referring to it as the most sort of international in nature event that the pro-Putinists, the campus, whatever you want to call them, have organized so far, calling for negotiations. It's an event, the in-person event will take place in New York at a place called the People's Forum. People involved in the campaign will be there with pickets. They'll participate if they're allowed to, but the rest of us who aren't in New York can participate online. We have a flyer that's almost ready to go for this event. And actually I could we'll be posting it soon and it'll be available for distribution. But it's just really important that as many people as possible who are in the side of solidarity with Ukraine participate in this event. So just wanted to announce that again. There'll be information about it on the Facebook page. And again, Brian posted the link to register in the chat. So, okay, we've got Luke, go ahead.
Thanks. I realize that my comment really might just kind of open up the discussion more, but I'll say it. And if, and the meeting doesn't have to go on. I suppose, well, one, I think the problem with the DSA, and a problem that any left group does face, any new left party, is its very anti-democratic nature. So I think outside of, perhaps positions that folks take in regards to international issues within the leadership, the organization itself is just very much hostile to real debate and democracy. So I think that is a major blockage. The other thing, that I just think about, and I know it's the age-old question that we can probably all talk about until the cows come home, so to speak, but just that if there is, and hopefully there will be, some, and I'm sure there will be, genuine expressions of discontent and outrage that manifest in the streets, that without something existing, where will that energy and organization go to? And so, again, the project I've been involved in the DSA is about uniting the existing disparate left tendencies within the DSA, and ultimately then trying to turn the DSA into some kind of organization or something that comes out of that through unity of the existing left, as a new project, to create something so that then when that energy does come, it doesn't kind of go off or inevitably, I shouldn't say inevitably, but get potentially co-opted by the very strong force of the Democratic Party. Thanks.
Before I call on Pete and then Avram, who've already spoken once, I see Brian's note in there. I just want to see if anybody who hasn't spoken yet would like to speak. Anything, Melody, would you like to speak? I'm putting David, Bill Young, Olivier, John Anderson, Frank, anybody? Okay, all right.
I just have a procedural question.
Oh, okay.
No, I just want to know for the 19th, I'm going to try to go. If there's identifiable banners or something, because I don't get stuck with the code pink people.
Okay, well, I have a suggestion. If people that are interested in November 19th can stay after we finish this official discussion, that'd be great, because we can talk in more detail about that. I think that would be great if people do that, because Brian also.
I'm not sure I can stay, but I'll see what I can do. But if it's not, I'll just get in touch with you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, very good. Okay, I'm going to call on Frank because he hasn't spoken yet. And then Pete.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. Actually, Stan Heller is the one who invited me to become part of this group. And I find it very interesting. And it's a very complex issue because we have so much to face on the national and international scale. And the resurgence of extreme nationalism is such a major problem in the world, but also the problem within the left, the split between those who are now basically soft peddling Putin and his regime. And I like what Luke said about gathering all the forces of various left groups that within the DSA, but even in the larger society as a whole, we need to develop methods to become a community and to really engage with all of these different disparate fragmented movements. And that's a difficult task because it really involves creating a kind of ideological unity that doesn't exist. And part of the problem, I think, which we haven't, I don't know if this has even been raised, is the perception within the larger working class of socialism and the left in general. And that to me is a very big problem because the history of the failures in the Eastern Bloc countries and other countries that have attempted to create some version of socialism has created a base even within the working class in the United States. And many of them are immigrants from those countries who have a very, very strong suspicions and strong questions about it. And so I think we have to also figure out a way to address those while building a movement within these different disparate movements that are already out there and building a larger community of resistance. That's about all I can come up with right now. I'm still trying to digest everything everybody else has said, so excuse me.
Okay. Avram, go ahead. And then I think we're going to close discussion and talk about November 19th.
Oh, no, I was going to see if I didn't have a question.
Okay, John, I think you kind of did your follow-up. Is there anything else briefly, very, very briefly that you'd like to say? And then I think we should spend the last 10 or 15 minutes talking about November 19th, where we have still a good group here. Unmute.
Yes, please. First of all, in relation to Ukraine, just as the victory of Putin in Ukraine will boost the far right around the world. You can say the same as far as the victory of Trump or the Republicans, that will boost the far right around the world, and also would strengthen Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So the two, I think, are interlinked. But the main thing I think that we should really keep in mind is that we have to think in terms of not what we want to happen, not the kind of movement that we would like to see, but what conditions, what kind of movement will history and the current and the current conditions bring about, force into existence? What kind of movement do we think is both necessary and possible? And I've kind of expressed my view on it, and I think that also we have to learn to think and talk in terms of relating to that movement, and even when it doesn't exist yet. And as far as this issue about what direction will a movement turn to, I don't think it necessarily has to turn to a pre-existing organizations, especially when there's no organization that I know of, and I have to say it, that includes DSA, which is actually stands for building that kind of chaotic, wild, militant fighting movement in the streets. And so I think that what we have to do is think in terms of, well, what kind of organization can such a movement start? How can an organization, which is to say, really a political party, start to develop out of and through such a movement? And finally, I'm not belittling the lessons that we here who are a little bit longer in the tooth that we've learned over the years. But again, I think that we have to learn to relate those lessons and our experiences to the younger generation, which will really be the salvation of this planet if there is to be one.